Welcome to Longevity Industries' presentation of the Destiny of Manufacturing podcast. I am your host, Dean Phillips, and I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Precision Metal Forming Association and the PMA's Educational Foundation. I have with me today Terry Wohlers from Wohlers Associates, where he is the president. Terry, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Dean.
It's great to have you here. And you come out of the world of additive manufacturing. And what is your big takeaway for the next 5 years in manufacturing?
Well, if you look at the ingredients that have been coming together in the recent years, companies, especially the users of the machines, materials, and services, they are wanting to take this into manufacturing. So just to give you some context, for more than 30 years, the technology has been applied for models, prototypes, some forms of tooling, jigs and fixtures, and some other applications as well. The next frontier is really to apply it to production quantities, and that's where companies want to take this. And we're seeing examples of that in various industries. In 5 years' time, I think it will be mainstream at certain companies. I can't say industry-wide, like let's say, for example, aerospace, but many aerospace companies and medical device companies are taking this into manufacturing. Some are still in relatively low quantities, relatively low number of part numbers, and so they're just getting started. Others are, for example, Airbus, Boeing, Honeywell Aerospace, and a number of others have been doing this for years, so they've made more progress in this area. But the point is that I anticipate that many companies will see this becoming mainstream within their organizations, and that's exciting because that's where the money is. That's where the biggest opportunities lie. Not to downplay the importance of using it for design, validation, and prototyping. Very important, and these companies will continue to apply it in that way, but really to produce parts using this new way of design and manufacturing is very, very exciting.
Yes. Do you see, so scaling is your probably the biggest thing that you see changing over the next 5 years. Now, tell us about your background. How did you get involved in manufacturing, and what spurred that interest in you?
Well, I'll try to make that a short story. It goes way back to the early 1980s after finishing graduate school, starting Wohlers Associates in 1986, really focused on CAD/CAM applications. We did some training and so forth back then. And then discovering additive manufacturing. Back then, only one process was available, and that was stereolithography. And that was introduced to the world in 1987. I heard about it, learned about it, and as they say, the rest is history. I mean, I just got so excited about the possibilities that the technology presents to be able to, because solid modeling back then, or CAD solid modeling, was fairly new, but thinking, wow, what a companion to 3D CAD, to be able to realize, to be able to print your designs, and to be able to touch and to do fit analysis and so forth. And so soon after then in 1987, other companies then also, besides 3D Systems was the first, and then Stratasys, and a company that did powder bed fusion and polymers, and a number of other companies then began to introduce these processes that allow you to slice a solid model, digital model, into horizontal cross sections and then print them layer after layer. And what that allows, of course, is to be able to produce parts of very high complexity, or to consolidate many parts into one that you would otherwise have to manufacture individually and then assemble.
Yeah. That's an interesting perspective. I think a lot of people, let's say, don't have a good perspective of what the value is for additive, and it isn't to I think for most people, they think, well, how can I make this part in a different way? But that's really not the advantage. It's, as you mentioned, how do I take 15 parts and make them doing one process?
Well, that's true. It's but that does require a redesign or rethinking of how you design the part. So it or assembly. So it does require, it may look entirely different at the end, because you can also not only consolidate many parts into one, but you can also optimize to optimize the weight to strength to weight ratio using methods of topology optimization, which is really letting mathematics decide where to put the material to optimize that strength to weight. And so what you can end up with in the end is something that looks very different, yet it functions as good or better than the old design, and often is lighter weight, and sometimes substantially lighter in weight.
Right. And especially in so many different fields where that's critical, not just important, but critical when we talk about fuel optimization and improvement. The weight to strength ratio is such an important aspect of that it cannot be overlooked.
Well, that's correct. It has many benefits beyond fuel. One is, of course, that's a big one: aerospace, automotive, and some consumer electronics and other fields. But it also means that you use less material, and material can be expensive. And so if you can reduce it by 25%, 50%, that's a big cost savings in material.
Yes. Yeah. And now, when you look at some of these applications out there, do you feel a lot of it is kind of in these stages where we used to be with machining, where you're only machining one part at a time in a lot of cases, and that's where a lot of what we're doing today is in this additive world, is the limitation comes from the number of parts you can make at one time?
Yeah, so companies do want to scale this to manufacturing quantities, and one of the limitations to additive manufacturing is speed. The machines are becoming faster. In the case of laser-based processes, they're adding more power to the lasers or multiple lasers. And it's not just the processing of the parts, it's also the post-processing. So what I mean by that is, once you finish a set of parts, often they need to be finished in some way. In the case of metal parts, they have to be removed from the build plate, and then a lot of work can begin. And to the extent that you can design so that you can reduce the amount of manual labor and really streamline the amount of post-processing, because that cost can be substantial. And so companies are looking at that and trying to factor that into the overall cost of the process. So these are issues that are not as important when you're building models and prototype parts, but when you're manufacturing, it's largely about, of course, quality, but also speed.
Absolutely. And that's what everybody's looking towards, is how do I use this tool, this new tool in my arsenal, to be able to produce parts and do it in a way that's fast, and even as a trade-off to speed, if the part is quality or, as you mentioned, finished or closer to finished, the more optimal that can be for somebody when they're looking at this process of additive manufacturing.
That's correct.
What do you see in the materials world changing?
Well, for many years, particularly in polymers, we had a limited number of options, and we still do in comparison to conventional plastics processing. But now we have a few hundred options, whereas not that long ago, if you back up 15 years, we maybe had 100, maybe not even that many, if you can take into account the older materials that new materials had replaced. And so we do have more of a choice of materials, but many would argue that it's still lacking, particularly in the area of composites. We'd like to see many of those. And of course, the material can be tied to the process. So it's one thing to develop a material, but if it can't be processed well within a particular additive manufacturing machine, then so they really have to be linked. They have to be done together, process development with materials development. And so companies will partner to do that, but there's still a big appetite for more materials. In metals, that problem isn't quite as big as with polymers. We're seeing machines that can really accept a very wide range of metal powders, for example, in the case of metal powder bed fusion, and that's typically using a laser, sometimes an electron beam energy source to solidify each layer of material. And so one of the challenges that companies where regulation is important, such as aerospace and medical, it's there's another hurdle to cross. You can technically maybe process a new material, but then it needs to be qualified and then certified, the design for that particular regulatory agency. So that can take time and often measured in years. So that's only material may be available, but that doesn't mean they can produce that new design with that material without extensive testing.
Right. And I think a lot of times when we talk about things like testing and material science, when you have to go through those regulatory processes, especially in the medical field or in aerospace too, has become an issue too, is that it's one thing to go ahead and be able to produce these parts. It's a whole different world, though, when you have to go ahead and get approval, because especially when you get into aerospace and in medical, somebody's life is on the line with these devices, and they want to make sure that everything you're doing with these new processes and new materials is as good or better than what's already there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fortunately we have great people working on these problems at companies, and the regulatory agencies like the FAA and the FDA. They are attending various conferences and meetings to really understand what this is all about and to anticipate where this is going and what they need to do to support the development, because they also see great opportunities and they know that companies are going to continue to develop around this technology, so they need to be well equipped as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you see what do you see the biggest bottleneck in these processes now? Is it people that understand the processes or the material technology, or is it more on the side of the equipment? I think there's some kind of a line in there where we need more people being brought in to be exploring this technology. Do we have enough people that are up to speed on these technologies, or is that the kind of the bottleneck?
Well, yeah, there's if you look at what's holding it back, what are the big hurdles to cross and overcome? Several. I'll maybe mention two or three. One is cost. It's still relatively expensive to build parts additively, but at certain volumes it can be less expensive. So determining that break-even point where it's less expensive to do it this new way versus the old way, and to calculate that break-even point is, on the surface it should be easy, but if you're building the part exactly the same as with the previous process, then, well, even in certain quantities, you might be able to build a business case. But most of the time, no, you can't. Only in very low volumes. So even in volumes of hundreds of parts, it can be far more expensive to do it additively. However, here's the big catch. If you redesign that part using, say, topology optimization, or the bigger gain can be to combine many parts into one digitally, then suddenly the numbers change dramatically. I mean, it's in a very, very big way. But to get to that, you have to have a team of people, or you could outsource, but some companies don't want to do that because the designs are so sensitive. But to begin to redesign and then to do that cost analysis, but that takes a major effort. You need to train people to do the design, redesign. You need software tools that you probably do not have currently. And so it takes a lot just to determine whether or not you can use additive manufacturing for production applications. And that I see as the biggest hurdle today. Now, as cost gets driven down on both the machines and materials, that problem won't be as big. But you still will have it depending upon the quantities that you're manufacturing. And to be competitive, because if your competitors are doing this and you're not, you may be forced to update your people, your software tools and so forth to redesign and come up with these really wild, sometimes wild shapes and geometric features that you wouldn't be able to manufacture with conventional tools.
Right. What do you think is the opportunity for closing the loop on some of this technology with IoT, more sensors on there? Because a lot of the early additive processes didn't have a lot of sensors. You may have had a temperature sensor for like the bed temperature and the feed rates and things like that, but it was sort of open loop. You were assuming that it was actually feeding when and through the nozzle and the heating element of it was actually occurring. But actually now with some of the sensors to be able to follow and track that it is working, it is processing properly, and being able to close the loop to optimize some of this so that it requires less tweaking, less operator involvement. What do you think about some of the opportunities in that aspect?
Well, it's you hit the nail on the head as far as what is being worked on, and but it's work in progress. Companies. You can name the top companies in this business. They are working very hard, and in some cases with partners and third-party companies are developing solutions to do what you described. I mean, we really need smart systems that can see problems. Well, number one, see the process to ensure quality as parts are being built. What's really interesting about this technology is, in theory, we should know more about an additive part than a casting, certainly a casting, but even a machine part, because we can see every step of the way the process being, taken from a very, very fine powder, particles as small as 20 microns, to a solid finished part. We can see every step of the way in a very, 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 very small scale. And so, but it produces a tremendous amount of data, and to be able to close the loop, as you said, to maybe identify a problem and fix it on the fly. Today, where we're at with that is it'll flag a problem, but then it may stop the machine, and then it's up to you to mill off that layer, put it back in the machine, and then resume the build. And that's very disruptive if you're in production.
Oh, yeah.
And so you really you don't want to do that, obviously. And so, companies are trying to overcome that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those things, I think, in many cases, how do I prevent it is worth so much more than fixing it.
That's right.
What are some of the other industry challenges for some of the different technologies to be more friendly to additive manufacturing in some of the different technology sectors? What do you see some of the challenges we have to overcome to get additive in some of these other industries?
Well, I think a lot of it is around software, especially if you get into the consumer type applications where you want a certain amount of information from a consumer if you're doing, say, footwear, for example, or eyewear, or parts for bicycles or even automobiles, and so that is largely software. We have the hardware and the materials and so forth, oftentimes to do this, but how do you do it in an accurate and efficient way? So it's really the front end of the process, so that consumers can enter or measure or somehow get that information into the system. Now, a few companies have been able to do that, and they are marketing and selling some really interesting eyewear, footwear, and so forth. But I can't say any of them have scaled to the point where it's certainly not in the millions, but the thousands at this point. And so I think that might be the biggest challenge, is to do that. It's one thing to develop the software, but then it's a whole nother to market and get adoption among your customers, and that's a big part of it.
Do you think that the challenge of open versus closed software has helped or hindered the industry's progress? I know when MakerBot first came out and everything was open, then they got bought out and then kind of closed all that system off. Do you think that helped or hindered the progress that's transpired since then?
Well, I think for additive manufacturing to be successful in for production, I think we need to learn from the past. If you look at conventional plastics processing, for example, and metals, how are those machines and materials and software, how does that come together, and what amount of freedom do customers have with those products that they purchase and use? And I think we need to look at that and use that as a model for additive manufacturing. If we close down systems so that, hey, if you want new software or a different material, you have to come to me to get it, and we're the only source, that's going to slow progress and adoption, because if that company's supply slows or shuts down for whatever reason, you need a backup. You need a number 2 and number 3 supplier, and so that's the way it works with conventional manufacturing. And I would expect that most customers would expect the same from the producers of additive manufacturing products.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, I think, that database, so to speak, of materials is very important across the board for education, for research, and for, in the long term, productivity in manufacturing is going to require more of that kind of data. Where do you see a lot of the manufacturing that's struggling with recruiting and retaining some of the best and brightest minds? Are there things we can do to try and get people more interested into additive?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's it's certainly I'll call it sexy technology. I mean, it's probably received more press and just visibility than most other manufacturing processes. If you look in the last many years, it's because there's such a breadth of application, and many schools are buying the low-cost desktop machines, and so they're adding it to their CAD classes. Universities are now offering courses, and even some are offering degree programs around additive manufacturing. So that'll create talent. So I mean, what you mentioned, human resources and talent is certainly a bit of a problem in this area. The short term is, how do we update our current workforce out there? What can be done? We've been offering design for additive manufacturing courses. These are 3-day hands-on courses that really teach and allow them to practice some of these software tools and learn methods and, a new way of thinking. And, that's a big part. So you have that, but then also, technician training for running the machines and just understanding the opportunity and when it makes sense to do the cost analysis. That's more of a management function. And so all of that is, there's a big need for people that understand that. And I think the demand is certainly, bigger than the supply as we see it today.
Yeah. I think you hit on another point that I often refer to as being an incentive area is the accessibility and the availability of the equipment, and the cost is not as prohibitive, certainly on the entry-level machines. Now, certainly to get to professional grade, that can come later, but I think if you have a student or an employee who can learn on a entry-level machine, you can ramp them up from there as long as you get them trained on something so that they at least understand the basic principles.
That's right. It's a good way to start. Of course, some of these polymer-based desktop systems are dramatically different than metals, but the idea of solid modeling and slicing and printing, all of that is very similar, and having that as a foundation takes them a long ways, especially the CAD skills and understanding how to design for additive manufacturing. I'm not so sure many secondary schools are teaching that. They're teaching mostly, how to prototype, model and prototype with these machines, and but they have a good starting point on how these machines work and how you process the data.
Yeah. What are some of the biggest challenges you see coming down the road for as we do develop and we do get more involvement in this? What is the next hiccup that you see coming?
Oh, wow. Let's see. Well, I don't know that I really see any single hiccups. I just see there's these, list of things. I mentioned cost of machines, materials. The speed is certainly is a big one. These machines really, it would advance the industry a great deal if they were much faster, and they will become much faster. If you look at history, they have come up with ways to increase throughput. I think the biggest thing is companies, the managers and top management at companies really believing that this can take their company to another level. Not all companies. It doesn't apply to all industries, all companies, and all products within those companies. But for them to, where there's a fit, to identify the fit and say, okay, we're going to put resources toward this. We're going to invest in this and really drive this. And a lot of this comes from competition. They don't do it until their competitors do it.
Right.
They just sit back and say, we don't want to be the early adopters here. That's what happened in the hearing aid industry. It was really the first industry to adopt it industry-wide, where Starkey Labs was one of the pioneers, but then Phonak and Siemens Hearing Instruments, they really got credit for developing and commercializing the technology. Then Widex and the GN Resound and the rest of them came in, and they did it not because they felt that they did because their competitors were doing it, and their customers, which are really the audiologists and that part of the industry, were seeing them as being behind the times. If you weren't building these hearing aid shells additively, then hey, there's something maybe wrong with your company. Mm-hmm. And so that needs to happen and is beginning to happen in aerospace, medical devices, and it's interesting when companies are motivated through competition. If they feel like they may not survive, then they will get it done somehow, or at least attempt to. But to be out on the forefront, to take those risks and invest, millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars when their competitors are not doing that, that doesn't always happen. Only a select few will do that.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Terry, we are just about out of time, so please tell everybody how they can reach you.
Well, the best is if you Google the last name of myself and company, Wohlers, Wohlers. We Google is kind enough to give us the first many references, and so you can find our company quickly that way. And we would be happy to answer questions and help your listeners.
Excellent.
However we can.
Great. Thank you so much for being here today. And I want to thank our sponsors, the Precision Metal Forming Association and the PMA's Educational Foundation. To listen to other episodes from our podcast, go to longevityindustries.com and click on podcasts, or you can go to your favorite podcast venue, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, radio, you name it. We're pretty much on all of them. And if you have any questions or comments, please send them to me, Dean@longevityindustries.com. Thank you, everybody. Go out and make it a great day.